Okay, shall we get started here? Went an extra long on that intro. Sorry about that. But that is the way it goes sometimes. And before we get started, now we're going to read 4 more chapters of Red Harvest. But before we get started, I got something to show you all, if they work. I have a few new things I added in as far as using channel points. So I'll show you one of them here real quick.
I aim to misbehave.
So they're all just short like that. I think there is one that's longer, but there's 3 or 4 of them in there. If you want to use up some of your points, you can throw those in any time. Let's see, 1, 2, 3. Yeah, there's only 4 of them right now. So I disabled a lot of the other stuff just so they're easier to find for the moment. But anyway, kind of learning more about how to get this stuff set up. So I'm enjoying that. Anyway, let's get into the book. So we're on chapter 23, titled Low Boy. Where is everybody? That was what Kendra had asked Rot when they were outside, and he'd blown it off, or pretended to, because he didn't have an answer, or because the answer he had was too deeply disturbing to vocalize. But the question returned to him now, down in the dorms, as they went through room after room, finding nothing but empty, silent bunks and vacant corridors. They had been running for some time, but Kendra didn't even sound as if she was out of breath, and Rot realized that he was starting to feel better, too. Moving around had helped clear his head, steadying him. Even his arm didn't hurt as much anymore. Being young had its advantages. Ain't that the truth? Going low had been Kendra's idea, a means of buying time until they figured out what they were up against, and despite Rot's avowed intention to go to the infirmary and get checked out, he'd followed her, for now anyway. They'd run inside a long utility corridor to a place where it branched off in a 3-pronged intersection. The permasteel ceiling oozed condensation just above him, and the long tube lamps embedded in the walls let off a pale, achromatic glow in the hanging clouds of moisture. The opposite end of the corridor intersected another group of dorms, and that was where they'd run into 2 other students, Hartwig and Mags. "What are you 2 doing down here?" Hartwig asked. He frowned at Rot. "Dag, man, what happened to your arm?" "Training accident," Rot said evenly. Hartwig smirked. "Fail?" "Meaning what?" "Meaning that," Hartwig pointed at the wound. "Doesn't look like any training accident I ever saw. What did you do? Fall on a vibro blade or something?" "I was in the pain pipe." Rot held Mags and Hartwig in the same regard that he did the rest of his classmates, with a kind of suspicious indifference. Their motives were purely selfish, as were his. He had no intention of sharing information that didn't somehow improve his own situation. At this point, they all knew something had gone very wrong. contaminating the academy or the entire planet. For the moment, they were allies of opportunity. Have you guys seen anything else down here? What do you mean, anything? Hartwig asked. Or anybody? No, Mags cracked his knuckles nervously. Not yet. Weird, huh? It's pretty early for it to be so quiet. I heard there was some kind of assembly earlier, but Wig and I missed it. If we're going any farther, Kendra cut in, we're going to need weapons. Our best bet is dividing up. She pointed up ahead, where the corridor pronged into 3 separate halls. Searching these hallways in groups of 2 and... Wait a minute, Hartwig said. Who put you in charge? In charge? Kendra turned, and Rot saw that she was staring directly at Hartwig. Her gray, almost translucent irises like newly formed frost. Nobody asked you to tag along. Her eyes flashed off Rot. Any of you. Hartwig shrugged uneasily. I'm just saying. What? We all feel something kind of bad in the air, right? Like maybe some kind of a disease? But who's to say it's not just one of Scabrous' drills? Kendra's eyebrows went up. Excuse me? For all we know, he started this himself. Why? Maybe it is a training exercise, Mags put in. Or maybe he's culling the weak students. It's happened before. Remember the Unaki eye spiders? This is worse, Kendra said. Don't be so sure, Hartwig said. 11 students went blind. 2 of them died. Remember Soid Einray? Soid Einray was a defective already. Maybe, but he still hung himself afterward, and then we found out that Scabrous had reactivated the fertilized spider eggs from the pathogen bank as a nerve reflexivity drill. Hartwig refused to lower his stare. I still wake up with blood in my eyes sometimes. Kendra's expression didn't change. What's your point? You want weapons? I might know where we could find some, but I'm not going to risk getting in trouble with the masters if nobody's actually seen anything. Hartwig waited for a response, looking at Kendra, then at Rot, and finally let out a derisive snort. Yeah, that's what I thought. He turned to go. I'll see you puss bags around. Wait, Rot said. I saw something. Hartwig stopped and turned to look at him. Rot saw Kendra's tongue come out and moisten her upper lip, listening expectantly. 2 bodies fell out of Scabrous' tower, Rot said. They hit the ground. I saw them hit, and I heard the noise they made. They were dead. He swallowed. His throat was suddenly very dry. But then they got up. Mags and Hartwig were both staring at him now with various degrees of skepticism and outright disbelief. Rot discovered that he didn't care. Let them doubt. It would only make them better cannon fodder when the time came. Were you all alone when you saw this? Kendra asked. I was sparring with Lusk. Mags blinked at him, and Hartwig's eyes grew wide. Maybe it was just Rot's imagination, but he thought the mention of Lusk's name brought a paradoxical shiver of credibility to the moment. It was too unlikely a detail to be made up. One of the ones who fell was Wim Nichter, Rot said. After he hit the ground, he got up and attacked me. He was dead, but he was still alive. I had to pin him under a pile of rocks to get away. Out with the rest of it, then, he decided. That sickness in the air that you're talking about, that's Scabrous' doing, up in the tower, I think. He swallowed again, and this time his voice was steadier. I think he's bringing the dead back to life. There was a sharp rattle of footsteps from somewhere in front of them. Rot felt a sudden feeling of coolness rising up inside him, as if his skin were being stretched by gallons of cold water. When he spoke, his voice seemed to be transmitting from somewhere far away. Which way is it coming from? Cocking her head, Kendra pointed up ahead, where the main corridor divided into 3 sub-corridors, to the one that branched on the left. Up there, she whispered. You hear it? Rot's ears strained for sound. At first he heard nothing. Then they all did. A dragging, grating clank. It was advancing down the walkway with a graceless lack of stealth, growing steadily louder with every passing second. Rot began concentrating solely on himself and his own survival, forgetting all the others. The masters at the academy had trained them to fight as a unit when necessary, but a Sith warrior's true strength lay in his or her own personal will to power. When you could trust no one, fighting alone was axiomatic, a natural state. Flattening himself to the wall, he felt the Force's dark side coursing through him, a crackling electric chill that rendered fear and apprehension obsolete, and welcomed it. In that moment, he felt only a ready vigilance, weightless and unrelenting. Since arriving here on Odacer Foston, it was the closest to happiness that he dared let himself experience, yet in so many ways it was superior to any happiness he'd ever encountered. It made traditional happiness look anemic by comparison. All at once he realized that he could see what was coming, not with his eyes, but in his mind. "Relax," he breathed. "It's okay." Kendra wrinkled her forehead, about to reply, when the droid rattled from the end of the tunnel, stopped and regarded them dully. It was a bare-bones Sigma Series training unit, 8-armed, with belt treads and a force feedback intelligence implant so rudimentary that it was practically a piece of furniture. Rot hadn't seen one like it since he'd run newbie lightsaber drills, not long after his arrival here. Its copper-blue chassis was a dented utility cabinet, carbon-scored with hundreds of old marks from countless years of clumsy rookies. Heaving a sigh, Hartwig came away from the wall, watching the others emerge into view around it. "What's that thing doing so far down here?" Mags muttered. The droid clicked and produced a series of broken-sounding whirs, its equivalent of speech. Equipping such a unit with a vocabulator would have been pointless. Rot reached down and grabbed a loose strip of alloy sealant dangling from its undercarriage, pried it off, and wedged it directly underneath the thing's bulky central processor. He jammed the strip in as far as he could and twisted. "What are you doing?" Kendra asked. The processor cowl came loose with a snap. "If I remember right," he said, This thing's still got a visual mapping system. There's a typo here. I'm not sure what word that's supposed to be. I'm going to say placed. He placed his hand between two hot layers of components, which means it should still have a playback function. And whatever it's seen lately should still be stored somewhere in its memory bank. He didn't glance up. "Master Yakata used to make us watch our old drills this way, remember?" "Yeah," Mag said, but the space in front of them flickered and brightened with a cone of holographic blue light, the image sharpening, gaining resolution and depth. They all stood back looking at it, pale blue reflecting off their faces, none of them speaking. At first, Rot didn't quite realize what he was seeing. Mags was the first to break the silence. He sounded hoarse, as if he were still trying to whisper, but needed to clear his throat. "What is that?" Nobody answered. The hologram showed an area somewhere deep inside the tunnels where an indistinct mob of figures was teeming, not quite randomly, in the foreground. From their uniforms, Rot realized that they were Sith acolytes. But there was something wrong about the way their bodies moved, a jolting, uneven pace, and he couldn't see their faces. From this angle, it was impossible to tell how many there were. All he could see was that they were hunched together, working over what looked like a massive pile of debris, shoving and piling and dropping it into place in the corridor ahead of them. Within just a few minutes, the pile in the tunnel had grown noticeably higher. The light on the other side was narrowing to a thin band. "What are they doing?" Mags asked. Rod's voice was a non-specific whisper. "Building a wall." "Maybe it's some kind of barricade," Hartwig said, "so they can hold off whatever's out there." He caught his breath. "It must be. Look." Rot pointed at the hologram. "The angle's changing." "Maybe they've got weapons we can use." Mags was sounding excited now. "Yeah, look. That one's got a lightsaber." He was already heading up in the direction that the droid had come, I guess. "Let's move." "Wait," Rot said. "What?" Mags turned around, frowning. "What's wrong?" Rot was still looking at the hologram. The droid had broadened its field of view, dumping on bandwidth, and the image's signal-to-noise ratio had improved dramatically. Now the blue light cone showed a huge mob of bodies, dozens of them, more than he could even count, crammed together in front of the barrier. It looked like half the students at the academy were packed into that part of the tunnel. Rot pointed. "Their faces." Mags came back, hardly paying attention. "I don't see what," he said, and stopped. "Oh, no." Several of the Sith students in the hologram were turning and looking directly back at the droid. Their faces were slack and vacant, devoid of any emotion. It was the exact same way that Nictor had looked, up on top of the overhang. Rat saw that some of them had wounds on their faces and necks, and their uniforms were badly torn, hanging from their torsos like bloody sails. He watched as one of them, a student whose name he couldn't remember, brought his face directly up to the droid's holocam, a sly grin peeling over his lips. "Like Nictor," Rat murmured, and felt Kindra stiffening next to him in his peripheral vision. Hartwig said, "What?" "There's light on the other side of that barricade," Rat said, "but that's it." "So what are they doing?" Rat looked back at him. "They're walling us in." Ooh. And that's what I thought. But okay, so that's the end of 23. We'll jump into 24. This one is titled Seed. It was the orchard that saved them. Looking back, Zoe hadn't even been aware of exactly what she was doing, although that by itself shouldn't have been a surprise. A good deal of a Jedi's power was instinctive, a function of the Force, but it didn't make the situation any less disturbing. The things beneath them had started clambering up the rock face with a wow. Okay, that hit me all of a sudden. Where was I? The things beneath them started clambering up the rock face with a kind of manic agility, clawing their way toward her and Tolk in spastic bursts of movement. The whippet reached first, drawing his spear and thrusting it straight at the first one. Oh, reacted first, sorry. Impaling it through the chest and then hauling it upright, using the thing's own weight to drag it down and finish the job. Tolkes swung the spear around with the corpse still on it, bludgeoning the others, driving them back with a series of vicious thrusts. The plan went wrong almost immediately. Despite the fact that it had been run through completely, the thing at the end of the spear wasn't stopping. It wasn't even slowing down, and Zoe realized the other corpses had changed their approach, climbing up onto the overhang from the other side while Tolk was still struggling to kill the first one. "They can't be killed," a voice whispered from the back of her mind. "They're already dead. Look at them." At first she thought she was hearing her own thoughts, and then she realized it was the Murakami orchid, roiling in its own guilt and misery, yammering out words that she alone could hear. "Dead but alive, Hestazo, dead but alive. I did this to them. It was my fault. When Scabrous put me into that horrible vat, and now I'm inside them." Zoe stiffened. That must have been when she made the connection, on some level at least, because a moment later she was staring straight at the dead thing wiggling on the end of Tulk's spear. Except it wasn't really at the end anymore. It had pulled itself forward until it was almost close enough to grab the Whiffid's face. "I've got an idea," she told the orchard. "Grow." "What?" "You're in them now," she said, "aren't you? You're a part of them. You said so yourself." "Yes, but then grow." "I can't just—" "Don't argue with me. Just grow." It might have been that last command, the desperate vehemence of it. Vehemence? Whatever. So I mispronounced it. That stirred the orchid to action. Zoe saw the thing at the end of Tulk's spear stiffen and then fall abruptly motionless, as if it had just realized something profoundly unwelcome was taking root inside it. An instant later, a thin, green tendril began to wind itself out of the thing's right ear, extruding a vine that grew steadily thicker as it looped downward. Another vine appeared inside its left nostril, and then a third and fourth stalks and runners were snaking busily out of both ears now, some of them bearing small clusters of leaves, others thin black flowers. Thin. I don't know where I got that. Tiny black flowers. The corpse's mouth opened, and another stalk, this one as big around as Zote's finger, burst outward from its bloody throat. "Hestizo, this hurts. This hurts me." "Grow," she told it. "Grow. Just keep growing. Just grow." Looking around, she saw the others were experiencing the same effect, sprouting stalks and stems from every visible orifice. Their faces squirmed from within, wiggling plant life just underneath the skin. Zoe knew that it was working now. The orchid was in them, and the orchid was growing. She concentrated harder. She could actually see the flora growing inside the things now, driving it harder, farther, faster from within. Even as the orchid began crying out, begging her to stop, telling her that this hurt. It couldn't do it anymore. She ignored it and stared straight at the thing on Tulk's spear. She thought the word again, thought it with all the intensity and determination she could muster, over and over in a smooth and solid thought wave. Grow, 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 grow. The corpse's entire cranial vault exploded in a colossal splat of red and black and green. In the place where its skull had been, a bright spray of leaves flapped and writhed, winding outward, spilling down to encompass the entire upper half of the thing's torso. The body fell limp, sagging on the spear. Tulk dumped the thing with a brisk shoveling gesture, kicking it so that it barrel rolled over the edge, and then glanced back at Zoe. "You did that?" "Me and the flower." "You better do it again," the Whiffid pointed over the edge of the overhang at the other things. They were still sprouting, Zoe saw, but not as quickly, clawing back upward toward them. "Hestizo, please." The orchid sounded weaker now. "No more. Not now. I can't. It hurts." "You have to," Zoe said, unaware that she was speaking out loud. "You have to do it, because if you don't, they're not going to stop. They're going to kill us. They're going to kill me. Do you understand?" "So sorry, Hestizo." Silence, and it was gone. A hand closed around her ankle, jerking her forward from below. Zoe started to fall, landing on her side just as one of the things lurched upward, fully into view. She tried to pull away, but couldn't budge. "Grow," she pleaded with the orchid. "Grow, grow now." But the flower, wherever it had gone, whatever its abilities had been just moments before, was of absolutely no help to her now. She couldn't even hear its voice anymore, and the rippling movement under the other things' faces seemed to have stopped. There was nothing more they could do about them now. The orchid was tired, or absent, or dead. The thing on her leg was dragging her closer. "What are you doing?" Tulk shouted. He was stabbing furiously at the others without much effect. Stop them! I can't, Zoe shouted back. The orchid's not there anymore. All at once, something huge burst up out of the ground in front of them, a monolith, black and featureless, hurling up an enormous corona of rock and ice in its wake. From what Zoe could make out, it looked like a turret made of stone and durasteel, taller than the rocky outcropping where she was currently fighting for her life. Lights pulsed within it as its domed upper mounting swung toward them. She saw the gleam of a heavy turbine. The blaster pulsed twice, and the corpse in front of her disappeared in an acrid spray. Zoe blinked, wiping her eyes, and a massive amount of strength and momentum slammed into her from behind. The whiffid, she realized, knocking her off the top of the overhang just before the third blast pulverized it completely. They landed face first in the dirty snow, Zoe's ears ringing, her head splitting from the fusillade of laser blasts behind them. Massive hunks of smoking boulder and snow were showering down from above. Zoe stared back at the crater where they'd just been standing. "Run," Tulk ordered. "What?" "That way." He jerked his arm toward the long, hollowed-out tube-like structure 20 meters in front of them, and when she didn't move, the whippet shoved her forward just as the laser cannon pivoted again, tracking straight for her. And that's the end of 24. That one was a lot shorter. So, getting into 25, this one is titled Positive ID. "Statement," the HK's voice crackled from inside the comlink. "Sir, we located Hestezo Trace." The Sith Lord paused and adjusted the frequency until the connection became clear. He was standing in the bulkhead of the Mirakaw, having just finished a complete inspection of the vessel from top to bottom. Locating the bounty hunter's ship had not been difficult. The tower's sensors had found it crash-landed 2 kilometers outside the Academy, tracking it from the heat signature, and Scabbers had approached it with absolute stealth, on the off chance there might be someone aboard. But there was no sign of the Jedi or the Whiffid who had brought her here. The craft had been abandoned. "Where is she?" he asked. Response: Initial perimeter scan reports positive identification on the northeast quadrant. Scanners registered a 98.3% positive pheromone match. How long ago? Response: 10 standard minutes, sir. Coordinate vector 27 by 18. Order of magnitude. Is she dead? The slightest of pauses. Response: negative, sir. Per your orders. Good. Statement: Our mid-range scout systems report that she and the Whippet bounty hunter are traveling together, headed northwest toward the Tauntaun paddock in that near vicinity. They are still on foot and in all probability seeking immediate cover from the initial attack. The HK made a clicking sound, awaiting orders. Query: Shall I reactivate the perimeter cannons in that quadrant set for stun? Scabbers didn't answer right away, thinking about the terrain that the droid was describing. The tower itself wasn't far from there, of course, and the library. That won't be necessary, Scabbers said. I'll handle it personally. Statement. The droid sounded more tentative now. There is something else. What is it? Several local sensors are reporting unverified cluster activity in various quadrants around the Academy in general. It's unclear exactly what the source of the activity is. Biorhythm diagnostics aren't reporting any verifiable vital signs. Then fix it. Clarification. The electronics themselves are online and functioning normally. It's the activity it shows no sign of life, body temperature, respiration, heart, or brain activity. Scabbers stopped and gazed thoughtfully at the Mirakaw's dented metal bulkhead in front of him. For a moment the only sounds were the low, steady hum of the hemodialysis machine pumping fresh blood through his body, and the susurrus of fluids whisking through tubes, feeding him the cocktail of antiviral drugs. How much activity? He asked. Response: Unclear at present, the HK's voice said, but it seems to be... What? Well, it seems to be spreading, sir. I see, Scabrous thought. Scabrous thought of the apprentice, Nictor, or the thing that had once been Nictor, crawling out of its cage, despite the fact that all vital signs registered negative. He thought about how the thing had lunged at him and then gone after Jura Ostrogoth, the appetite that the thing had brought to bear. At that moment, Scabrous had assumed that what he'd seen was a kind of exaggerated nervous twitch, a biochemical accident that the drug and the orchid had triggered inside Nictor's body. But now it seems to be spreading, sir, the HK had said. He began to reconsider. My lord, the droid prompted. Never mind that now, Scabrous said. I'm going directly to the library. There will be no more need for lasers. Hestezo Trace will meet me there personally, and we shall finish our business together, she and I, as it was meant to be. Have my own ship prepared for immediate departure afterward. Yes, sir, but... Scabrous cut off the transmission and strode through the Miracaw's open hatch, down the landing ramp, and out into the snowy night. And that's the end of 25, so we'll jump into 26, the last one for the night. This one is titled Sub-Zero. In the first hour that Trace passed through the collapsed walls and stone temples of the Academy, the blizzard around him only worsened. It was as if the planet itself had read his arrival as a kind of infection on the cellular level and was fighting him off however it could. The temperature, already freezing, continued to plunge until his throat and lungs burned with every breath. The wind roared between the massive, boxy shapes of the buildings and substructures, the great slabs and half-submerged corridors. Its breath... I don't know where I got breath. Oh, I jumped up a line. That's where. Its scream was wraith-like, endless, the cry of something hungry for more than simple meat. Even the pellets of snow themselves felt sharper, jagging into his skin like tiny bits of shrapnel from an endlessly recurring explosion. In his peripheral vision, a shadow twitched and slithered. Trace stopped, hand reaching back for his lightsaber, and that was when he saw the man stepping out of the arched doorway to his left. Even before Trace glimpsed the man's face, he sensed the thin, bitter smile twisted over his lips, the threat of violence in those half-lidded eyes. The man's tunic and cloak blew out behind him, snapping whip-like in the irregular gusts of wind, and his voice, when it came across the broken landscape between them, was a low snarl. You landed on the wrong world, Jedi. Trace turned and faced him directly. The man was a Sith master. That much was readily apparent, perhaps an instructor at the Academy. I am Shak Weth, Blade Master here on Odasser Foston. I can only assume that you came here seeking humiliation and an unpleasant death. I'm here on other matters. Ah. The Blade Master cocked his head slightly, looking marginally intrigued. But you've found me instead. Trace nodded. Actually, it was only stillness that had found him, clarity of thought, and it came as a blessing. The cold, the darkness, the stinging wind, all of these outside factors had simply ceased to exist. His entire world had shrunk to the exact distance between him and the man who stood before him, an obstacle in the way of finding Hestezo. Trace felt everything inside him begin to relax and flow smoothly as the force spread through his nerves and muscles, generating a kind of weightless balance between action and intent. He drew his own lightsaber, felt it blaze to life in his grasp, a perfect extension of himself. The Sith Master's response was immediate. With a harsh grunt of fury, he flew at Trace, vaulting upward in the wind and angling the blade down with both hands, ripping through the ground where Trace had just been standing. The execution was flawless, a thing of almost organic brutality, as if the Blade Master had become a force of nature, another component of the blizzard that roared around them. Yet he was still too slow. Leaping sideways, Trace had spun around with his own lightsaber extended in front of him in a sweeping blow. The Sith Master was there, deflecting the attack and charging him again, hammering him backward with a vicious series of piercing thrusts and jabs, offering no quarter. Twice the blade came close enough to Trace's face that he could smell the scorched stubble on his cheek. The third slash came within millimeters of taking off his head. Trace realized that, regardless of what Shockweth had said a moment earlier, the Blade Master didn't intend to humiliate him, to toy with him or prolong the duel any longer than necessary. At this point, the Sith Master was attacking for the most primitive reason imaginable, to slaughter Trace and leave his steaming carcass in the snow. In that split second, Trace saw the rest of the duel playing out in two distinct ways, neither of which would last long. Death was hovering over them now like a scavenger, close and claustrophobic. He saw it reflected in the Sith Master's eyes. When the red blade came at him again, Trace jumped upward. He put everything he knew about Form 5's Gemso variation into that jump, leaping over Shockweth, spiraling through the flying snow, landing on the other side, and twisting around instantly, keeping his lightsaber at throat level with the intention of finishing the duel in a single stroke. Shockweth laughed, a bone-dry chuckle, and deflected the maneuver with mocking ease. He swung at Trace, and this time the Jedi felt a hot, bright stab of pain as the lightsaber seared through his cloak and tunic, slashing into the flesh along his rib cage. Drops of blood fell into the snow, disappearing as they melted. Too easy, Jedi. Now the Blade Master's shoulders and back were braced against the slouching stone wall behind him. Its outer surface cracked and half collapsed, and he tensed to spring forward. Now I shall finish you. As he arched forward, Trace saw a pair of hands shoot out from the broken wall behind him, gripping the Blade Master by the throat and jerking him backward. Shockweth slammed into the cracked stone hard enough to drop his lightsaber, and Trace saw a ghastly white face burst up through the open hole in the wall, a screaming face suctioning down on the Sith Master's right cheek and eye, teeth bared, gouging into his face. Trace took a step back, still holding his own lightsaber up, watching the thing that hauled Shockweth through the hole in the wall where it could more easily devour him. Great arterial eruptions spurted from the ragged perforation in the Sith Master's throat, spraying up over the wall and down into the snow and ice, painting the whole world red. Inside the wall, the thing lifted its face up, and Trace saw its eyes, flat and without the slightest spark of life. Yet they had once been human, even youthful. A Sith student, he realized, a teenager. What had happened? The thing shoved its mouth back down into the ragged red cup that had once been Shockweth's right eye socket, slurping noisily. When it paused a moment later, the noise that it made was a high-pitched, ululating scream, and Trace realized that there were other screams, countless screams. Another weird not spelled, but just misinterpreted word. I'm going to say a trinity. I can't make out what other word that could be. A trinity of them rising up along with it, coming from every direction at once. The night was full of them. And that is the end of 26. So, that is where we're going to leave this book for tonight. I'm doing 4 chapters a night. So, that leaves us at 27, Paddock. So, we'll pick up there next time. And, yeah, that'll be it. So, let's see. Who's around? What do we got going on? We've got some Fallout New Vegas. Uh, yeah, I haven't been to Count BB in a while. Let's head on over there. I will see you there in a couple of minutes. Ooh, there we go.